Getting ready to start Jimmy Rants. Hello, YouTube. Coming in, you guys. Getting ready to start my show, Jimmy Rants. Heard a noise on my computer. Oh, I had a notification. I've literally never heard a noise on this computer when I go live. So, well, welcome. Come on in. We're going to start Jimmy Rants over on Instagram here in just a moment. If you're brand new to the show, this is the side feed. I do a feed on Facebook and a feed on YouTube. The main show is right here on Instagram. So I look in the camera on Instagram for most of the show. I know you guys are there on YouTube. I know you guys are there on Facebook. So if I'm not looking right at you, that's why, if you're new to the show. But the main show is right here on Instagram over at the Jimmy Rants username. And yeah, we do a great show. Got a good study to go over today. I like doing the studies, analysis of the studies. Hello, Shirley. How are you? Anybody over here at the Facebook page? Last week I came on and I saw various people on, but they weren't talking to me. And the whole episode, I couldn't see anybody. All right, I see Bonnie just came in. All right, good. I don't know what happened last week. Hi, Bonnie. I don't know what happened last week where I couldn't see anybody. Nobody was talking. I don't know what happened, but it makes it bad because you guys have interesting things to say about what I'm ranting about, and I couldn't talk to you because you weren't there. All righty. Well, we're about T-minus about 1.5 minutes to go. Hello, Maria. Thanks for being here today. Usually I end up on Instagram. Yeah, it's so funny. I have people who watch on multiple platforms. I'm like, I'll see somebody on YouTube and then they pop up over on Instagram and I'm like, are you watching in both places? That has to be like echo. Like, is it in real time? I don't know how that works with the technology. If you go live on multiple, I am going to be adding another multiple one soon. I announced this on YouTube at the very end yesterday, but I'm going to get on Rumble. So Rumble is the alternative to YouTube because YouTube and Facebook and Instagram are all getting very censorship happy. Let's put it that way. I have to be ready to jump to other formats. And so I'm still working on how I can go live directly from jimmyrants.com in case if and I expect when they kick us all off of the social media platforms. Just be ready. Be ready. All right. Well, let's get this show on the road. And here we go. And it looks like it's going to give me that trouble like it did last week. All right. Let me stop. Go back in. This is why I go on early with you guys. Because you never know when stuff's going to mess up. And it mess up. That's all right. Let's try it again. They did a new study on low-carb diets and total energy expenditure. Does it go up on a low-carb diet? Find out the details here today on Jimmy Rants. JimmyRants.com is the website. And as always, join us live. We do go live at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, right here on Instagram. You got to go follow me. It's Jimmy Rants over on Instagram. I make it real easy for you to find me. Go check it out. We do lots of these Monday through Friday, 5 days a week. We do a Jimmy Rants episode. We also simulcast over here on Facebook as well as over on my YouTube channel. So thank you all for being here today. You can also watch the replay. If you're not able to come in live, I know a lot of people say, hey, I watched the replay. I appreciate you guys too. So if you're watching this on the replay, it is available on IGTV right here on Jimmy Rant's Instagram page. It's also over on the YouTube channel. If you type in a keyword Jimmy Rants, you will find the show. And then finally, it's available over at the official website for this show. It is jimmyrants.com. And while you're there, just noodle around. You can see all of the past episodes, 622, I believe, episodes now. So we are rolling on a river. Okay, I'm showing a little CCR old school there. All right, so guys, today I have another study. I love looking at studies that sometimes it's a bad study. I've got a bad study coming up on Thursday, which we'll tell you all about at the end of the show today. We'll give you a little sneak peek. But this study is a good one because one of the benefits of a low-carb, ketogenic style diet is you actually see a greater burn of calories. And through that greater burn of calories, by extension of that, it leads to greater fat loss. And so that's what the study was about. It was published in the Journal of Nutrition, and it's Dr. David Ludwig. His name might sound familiar. He does a lot of really great studies out of Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. And he was joined up by Kara Eberling, who's also another big ketogenic diet study author, Stephanie Dickinson, Beat Henschel, and David Allison. I don't know who those three people are, but David Ludwig and Kara Eberling is on a lot of great research when it comes to low-carb diets. And what they wanted to test was the whole idea of low-carbohydrate diets increasing total energy expenditure, because there's a lot of things that are said online about low-carb diets that some are true, some are definitely not true, and then others we just don't know because the science hasn't shown it yet, which is why I love it when we get research that gets published in journals, because this is stuff that we can cite. So this one here, like I said, it was published in the the Journal of Nutrition is where it was published just a few days ago. December 3rd is when this came out. And it's all about this particular subject of total energy expenditure on a low-carb diet, an updated and reanalyzed meta-analysis of 29 controlled feeding studies. So just to kind of, for those of you that don't read studies, a meta-analysis is where they look at a lot of different studies, okay? And through those different studies, they come to conclusions based on what they see with the totality of the studies. It's not a great study design. I've kind of railed against using these to make absolute conclusions, but what it does do is it gives you a great hypothesis building type of research so that you can then go do the really good research. So let's get into this study. All right, the abstract. In the background, it says the effect of macronutrient composition on total energy expenditure remains controversial, with divergent findings amongst the studies. One source of heterogeneity may be study duration, as physiological adaptation to low-carb diets require at least 2 to 3 weeks. So I love that they're acknowledging that even in the background of this, because a lot of times when they do low-carb research, they do only look at them for a week or two. And those of you that are trying to pursue nutritional ketosis, you know, it takes at least 2 weeks for you to get in that state of nutritional ketosis. So if they stop at 2 weeks and they show some decline in total energy expenditure, what happens if they pushed it to 3, 4, 5, 6 or longer weeks? Do they see an increase? And so that's what they wanted to see looking at this meta-analysis of the various data. So the objective was to test the hypothesis that the effects of carbohydrate as a percentage of the energy intake on total energy expenditure, does it vary depending on how long you do it? So they wanted to see that by looking at this meta-analysis. So the way they did that, the sample included trials from a previous meta-analysis as well as new trials that were in a PubMed search. They looked at March 9th, 2020, all the studies that came in up to March 9th, 2020. And what they did was they compared lower and higher carbohydrate diets, controlled for energy intake or body weight. 3 reviewers independently extracted data, and they reconciled all the discrepancies that were in the data. The effects of total energy expenditure were pooled using inverse variance weighted meta-analyses with between study heterogeneity assessed using the statistical anomaly. Meta-regression was used to quantify the influence of the study duration, dichotomized at 2.5 weeks. So basically what they did was they're trying to standardize, okay, if we're going to use a study that only went 2 weeks and we're going to use another study that went 6 months, so we use another study, they want to make sure all of the timelines match up so that then when they make a conclusion, it's based on all the timelines and similarities in the data that they see. They're looking for a pattern to see what's happening between the studies. So in the results, there were 29 trials, ranged in duration from one day. They found some studies that were 1 day of a low-carb diet. What can you do on a low-carb diet for 1 day? Ooh, I ate steak today. There's my 1-day study of low-carb. Up to 140 days. So the longest study was 140 days. The shortest one was 1 day. The average, listen to this, the average, 4 days. So they must have had a lot of like very short studies of low-carb diets in this. If you add up all the participants in those 29 trials, there were 617 people in the trial. The difference in carbohydrate between the intervention arms ranged from as low as 8% carbohydrate, which I would call a ketogenic level of carbohydrate intake, up to 77% in the high carbohydrate range. The average for all of the studies that they looked at, all the 29, the average carbohydrate intake was 30%. Compared with reported findings in the prior analysis, we found greater heterogeneity in this study. Study duration modified the diet effect on total energy expenditure among 23 shorter trials. So of the 29 trials, 23 of them were shorter. Total energy expenditure was reduced on the low-carb diets. So get this, on the low-carb diets in the shorter trials, they saw total energy expenditure, in other words, calories burned in a day, go down. They saw it reduce. With substantial heterogeneity among 6 longer trials. So in the 6 longer trials, total energy expenditure was increased on low-carb diets, expressed 10% decrease in carbohydrate, and you got the total energy expenditure effects in shorter and longer trials, that it actually increased when you go beyond that 2-week period. So the conclusion is lower carb diets transiently do reduce your total energy expenditure in the beginning, with a larger increase once you pass the 2.5-week mark. These findings highlight that there is an importance of having longer trials looking at low carbohydrate diets to understand the chronic macronutrient effects and to suggest a mechanism whereby low carbohydrate diets may facilitate in weight loss. So it's an interesting study, and we're going to get into the full details. That was just the abstract. And if you're just joining us, I have a brand new study published in the Journal of Nutrition. Dr. David Ludwig and his team there at Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School, and they're looking at low-carb diets and what effect they have on total energy expenditure. So to define terms, I took a screenshot from a clinical definition in a study of what total energy expenditure is. So you can see it on your screen. Total energy expenditure is the total energy costs of the processes essential for life, things like basal metabolic rate. So that's just where you're just existing, you're just living. So the BMR of the energy expended when you digest, when you absorb the nutrients from your food, and you convert the food into the various functions in the body. You get thermogenesis going on. So whenever you have, whenever you eat, it puts off heat. If you go into cold thermogenesis, that also uses up energy. There's lots of ways that your body uses energy. And then the energy expended during physical activity, and that energy as well. So those are all the ways that the body expends energy, uses energy, and uses it up. So what they wanted to see in this study was does a low-carb diet increase that? And by increasing that, it would seem to be a methodology by which you could lose weight, be leaner, and all the things. And so it's a very fascinating concept that they wanted to test. And again, if you joined us late, we are looking at a meta-analysis of studies. So meta-analyses are not as great as a randomized controlled trial. What a meta-analysis does is it enables you to set a hypothesis for a good randomized controlled trial down the road. But they make a great point. These shorter studies, you're not really showing anything. Like if you're trying to show the veracity of a low carbohydrate diet, you can't get it done in 1 to 7 days. You can't really get it done in anything less, I think, than about 3 months. 3 months, you're going to know whether that low carbohydrate diet is doing anything or not. These people that do the 1, 2, 3 day low carb trials, you might as well just not. I mean, it's bad science. Let's just put it that way. All right, so let's get into the introduction of this study. According to some thinking, on a calorie per calorie basis, all sources of metabolized energy are alike in their effects on body energy stores and weight for practical purposes. This is what the calorie people say. A calorie is a calorie is a calorie is what they say. And so I often make the comment, well, if that's true, let's put someone on 1,500 calories of steak and eggs, okay? So let's put somebody on 1,500 calories worth of steak and eggs, and then let's get someone else on 1,500 calories worth of the junkiest of junk food. Snack cakes, pies, cakes, donuts, on and on and on. And if you do that study, I would love to see somebody take that study, because if a calorie is a calorie is a calorie, and we make sure that, I'm just saying 1,500, let's make sure whatever it is, the amount of calories that they need according to their basal metabolic rate, the BMR, see how many calories they need. There's little things you can blow into and see what your BMR is. And if it's 2,200 calories, then let that person eat 2,200 calories of steak and eggs, and then let the other person, the other group, have junk food. And it's the same calories. Now, you and I both know what's going to happen in that study. You're going to see far worse outcomes across the board with those who eat the junk food. But they say a calorie is a calorie is a calorie. Part, though, of why low carbohydrate works so well, why the steak and eggs diet, so to speak, works better than the junk food, it has nothing to do with calories in. It has everything to do with calories out. And so this total energy expenditure thing matters. That's why they wanted to look at this. In this view, any major effects on body weight resulting from macronutrient-focused diets, ranging from very low carbohydrate ketogenic diets to very low fat diets, result from the changes in the energy intake. That's the common thinking, that it's just about the calories. The reason a low-carb diet works, Jimmy, is because you lower calories. And they say that like it's a bad thing. And I've heard that my whole career. Well, low-carb diets aren't really special. They're just another version of a low-calorie diet. And I'm thinking, you hadn't met some people that I know that eat a low-carb diet. They're not cutting their calories at all. So it results in changes in energy intake as influenced by hunger, satiety, and other factors, not the total energy expenditure. So yes, you eat less calories when you eat a low-carb ketogenic diet because you don't have hunger. You don't have cravings. You've got satiety. That's part of the beauty of eating a low-carb, carnivore, real food type of diet. In support of this view, a recent meta-analysis of 28 feeding trials found that total energy expenditure was reduced slightly on a lower versus higher carb diet. So that was a big meta-analysis that came out, and it made this grand claim that, well, you're going to do that low carb diet, your total energy expenditure actually goes down, and that's not a good thing, you low carb people. But they only went for very short durations in that meta-analysis. So Dr. Ludwig and his team wanted to take that same meta-analysis, add in a few longer studies, and then make a new conclusion. So it was clinically significant, they say, the difference in that other study. However, the median duration included in the studies was just 4 days long. And we've talked about this. If you're going to look at the effects of a low carbohydrate diet, you've got to consider the adaptation period. And this came out in the 1980s, you guys. Dr. Steve Phinney, that guy back there on the wall, he did a study. He did one of the first studies looking at elite athletes and a low-carb diet. And they only wanted to go 2 weeks long on their study. This was in the 1980s, something like 1983. And so they did 2 weeks, and they saw that their performance was suffering compared to before going on the low-carb diet. And they were about to conclude in a paper, just like this one did about total energy expenditure. They were about to conclude that a low-carb diet actually reduces your performance, and they were going to publish that in the journal. Dr. Phinney, to his credit, said, no, let's go 1 more week. I want to see what happens if they keep going. And he was right. They got into a keto adapted state in that 3rd week. And by the end of the 3rd week, their ability to perform was at or above before they started the low carb diet. And so adaptation period is so critical. You can't really determine anything after 4 days. And I would argue 4 days of any nutritional intervention, 4 days. What are you trying to prove in 4 days? I don't think you're going to prove anything. And the potential effect of intervention duration was not reported. So they didn't even talk about that. You know, at the end of these studies, I usually talk about limitations of studies. They did not even include at the end of their study, the other people looking at this meta-analysis, they didn't even include, well, we have to account for 4 days is a very short period of time. Perhaps there would be benefit if they went longer than the 4 days, but they didn't give that caveat at all. Experimental and mechanistic studies suggest that the process of physiological adaptation to lower carbohydrate intake requires at least 2 to 3 weeks long. And again, thanks to Dr. Phinney, he was the one that kind of discovered that in his study back in the 80s. It raises the possibility that transient and longer-term metabolic effects may have been conflated. And this is true of any research, you guys. When you hear about study says, you need to see the context of the study. Yes, who paid for the study? Yes, the design of the study and all that. But when it comes to a diet study, and especially one like a low carbohydrate diet, you've got to take into effect, it can't be just a few days. You have to give enough time to see the effect, which is why I think at least 3 months in a low carbohydrate study, 6 months, a year, 2 years would be ideal. On a conventional diet, the brain relies upon glucose for energy requirements. With the restriction of carbohydrate to 50 to 100 grams, that's not ketogenic, but that's lower carb, 50 grams to 100 grams. Ketones and keto acids like beta-hydroxybutyrate, which are derivatives of fatty acids that cross the blood-brain barrier, that's ketone bodies, replace glucose as the major energy source for the brain, reducing demand for gluconeogenic substrates from protein, thus preserving lean mass. So 50 to 100 grams, a little bit high to be in ketosis. Generally, most of the doctors and researchers I have talked to, you really need to push it below 50 grams in order to, most people see ketosis. Can you see ketosis 50 to 100 grams? Sure. I know a lot of athletes that do. I don't know many people that have insulin resistance or other issues going on that can get into ketosis above 50 grams of total carbohydrate, but we'll go with it with what Dr. Ludwig had in his study. But even with the total elimination of dietary carbohydrate, aka fasting, the concentration of beta-hydroxybutyrate rises slowly, which reaching a steady state only after 2 to 3 weeks. So that's interesting. 2 to 3 weeks before you see a rapid steady state and da, 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 da. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't rise slowly to me. I mean, it depends on what your definition of slowly is. Mine goes up when I go on a total fast. Mine goes up by day 3, 4. I could be hovering below 1, and day 3, 4 be at 4.5. So I'm not sure what he's talking about, other than there's an adaptation that you go super high and then you come back down by the 2 to 3 week level. I have done 3 21-day fasts, and he is right that when you get that initial spike in the blood ketone levels, after that second week and into the third week, you do start to see it kind of level off at around 2.0. At least for me, that's what I saw. Further adaptations that may occur over weeks to months relate to the efficiency of beta-hydroxybutyrate transport to the brain, changes in muscle and liver metabolism, mitochondrial number and function, oxidative stress and inflammation, hormonal responses. In time course studies, negative nitrogen balance, which is indicative of lean mass loss, fatigue, increased hunger, and decreased exercise tolerance are characteristically observed during the initiation period of the ketogenic diet. So the so-called keto flu is what they're describing there. But adverse responses typically resolve after a few weeks. I don't even think it takes that long. I think a few days, if you're properly getting hydration, if you're properly getting all of the electrolytes, it doesn't last very long at all. Even with moderate changes in the macronutrient proportion, metabolic pathways facilitate carbohydrate to fat oxidation may adapt over several to get fat adapted without being in a state of ketosis. I still think you're going to be in a mild state of ketosis if you make that shift happen. Thus, a reduction in dietary carbohydrate may transiently suppress the total energy expenditure through multiple mechanisms, including but not limited to reduced voluntary physical activity level because of fatigue. So if when you first start on a low carb diet and you feel fatigued, that's going to lower your total energy expenditure. Makes sense, right? If this hypothesis is true, it might help explain heterogeneity amongst clinical trials and inform the design of weight loss treatments. So yeah, these studies don't take into account, these shorter studies of low carb diets don't take into account that there is this adaptation period, that there are side effects that could impact total energy expenditure, vis-a-vis you're tired, vis-a-vis you got headaches and you don't want to move. That's a big deal. To test the hypothesis, we reanalyzed and we updated all the prior meta-analysis with a specific focus on heterogeneity and effect modification by trial duration. So they wanted to see, did the length of the trial matter in the results? All right, so what they did was they followed the PRISMA, Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analyses, guidelines for article selection, data extraction, data analysis, and the reporting. By the way, it says here the work was funded by a grant from New Balance Foundation. I don't see here what that foundation does, but that's interesting. All right, so let's get into the search strategy and study selection. How did they find these studies they used? We included all 28 trials in the original meta-analysis. So remember, they were responding to that original meta-analysis and then they were adding new ones, except as described below, and conducted a PubMed search on March the 9th, 2020, attempting to identify new trials that had happened since 2016 that satisfied the search criteria as originally specified. So what they were looking for was energy expenditure or metabolic rate, or energy balance, or nutrient balance, or fat balance, carbohydrate balance, fat oxidation, fat mass, body fat, body composition, and dietary carbohydrate or low carb, or high carb, or dietary fat, or high fat, or low fat, or dietary protein, high protein, low protein, or macronutrient diet composition, dietary composition, indirect calorimetry, calorimeter, calorimetry, metabolic chamber, respiration chamber, respiratory chamber, doubly labeled water again. So that's all the keywords they put into this search of PubMed, trying to find studies that would be applicable to what they're doing. Is it New Balance like the athletic shoe? That's how they spell it. It just says New Balance Foundation. If somebody wants to do a DuckDuckGo on that and find out what New Balance Foundation is, I've literally never heard of that before. But that's the study, Cariana, who funded it. Trials were eligible if they met all of the following criteria. So this is how they determine which trials to put into this. They compared the effects of lower versus high carb diets, regardless of the absolute level of dietary carbohydrate proportion. Number 2, they controlled energy intake or body weight. Number 3, controlled dietary protein. That's always a must in these studies. You've got to keep protein pretty constant through the study. Number 4, provided foods to participants to enhance treatment differentiation. Number 5, utilized whole room calorimetry or double labeled water to measure the total energy expenditure. Trials were excluded if they had additional interventions like prescribed physical activity, the effects of which could not be separated from the dietary intervention. So they were trying their best to eliminate all the confounding variable studies so that they're doing apples to apples of the original meta-analysis. So our updated analysis excluded 2 studies in the original meta-analysis because there was duplication in the studies of the new studies that they found. All right, data extraction. The data was extracted independently by 3 co-investigators with any identified differences resolved through conversations. For trials that had at least 3 tests diets, the 2 diets with the most extreme differences in carbohydrate were included. When reported measurements, repeated measurements were reported, the last point time that had data on both diets was the one that was used, unless the primary outcome in the trial specified an average time point, and all were either greater than 2.5 or less than 2.5 weeks, as was the case in one of the studies. We excluded any time points in which ad libitum, which means unlimited amounts of food intake occurred. Yeah, so that's how they extracted the data that they used in this meta-analysis here. So the effect size calculation for each study, I know this is really nerdy, but this is kind of cool science to see how it is that that they take a look at the data to come to the conclusions. Cariana says, search says, yes, the same company. Apparently they have a disaster relief foundation too. Interesting. So New Balance Foundation. What does the New Balance Foundation associated with the New Balance shoe company want to do with a study about low-carb diets and total energy expenditure? The only thing I can think of is, all right, eat a low-carb diet and go out for a run. And go buy New Balance shoes. New Balance is the only ones I use, by the way. That's not a plug for them. I just happen to use them because they fit my big old boat 13 triple E wide width feet. So thank you for that, Cariana. See, we get live on the air reporters. Cariana, you are hired to be a correspondent for Jimmy Rants. All right, effect size calculation for each study. The effect size for the trial was calculated as the mean difference in total energy expenditure comparing the lower carbohydrate versus the higher carbohydrate diet. Changes from baseline were compared when data was available. Standard errors of the effect size were calculated when data was available from individual participant, along with estimated correlation between the diets in crossover studies. When data was unavailable, correlation between diets was imputed using the mean of the correlations for other studies with the same design. So what they're basically doing here, you guys, is setting it up so they can standardize the data across the board. It's one thing to look at a variety of studies, but if you don't use apples to apples data, the end data of your conclusion will not be accurate. So I appreciate the meticulousness that they go through trying to make sure this data is as similar as possible. All righty. When data was extracted from subgroups, we calculated a combined effect size for the study weighted by the inverse variances. All right, that's a lot of the kind of mathematics of all of this. We're going to get into the actual meta-analysis now. We performed a meta-analysis to calculate the pooled effect sizes to replicate the original work. Remember, they're responding to that original meta-analysis that concluded low-carb diets reduce total energy expenditure. We used fixed effects and random effects. For the updated analysis, we used random effects with restricted maximum likelihood. Heterogeneity was assessed using the standard Cochrane's Q statistic, calculated as the weight sum of squared differences between individual study effects and the pooled effects across studies as follows. So they show a little equation there. That equation right there is the one they used to determine. See that? Where N is the number of studies, X is the effect size for the study, WI is the weight for the study I. The little X with the squiggly is the pooled weighted effects across the studies. The 1 to the second power statistic describes the percentage of variation across studies due to heterogeneity rather than sample error. We first reanalyzed the effect sizes present for the 28 studies included in the original publication meta-analysis. We then updated the analysis by re-extracting all the data from those original studies, calculating the effect sizes, and excluding and adding studies as described previously for those final 29 studies. Because study duration accounted for a large degree of the heterogeneity, we performed the meta-analysis separately for both shorter and the longer-term trials. Several authors have proposed 2 to 3 weeks as the minimum time required for metabolic adaptation to reduce carbohydrate. We therefore dichotomized the cohort at 2.5 weeks. So because most of the studies they looked at, they found you're going to get adapted within 2 to 3 weeks. They just split that right down the middle and said 2.5 weeks is when you're going to see that switch take place. It provided an adequate sample to meta-analyze both groups. We also conducted sensitivity analysis, dichotomized at 2 and 3 weeks. Because the time course of physiological adaptation has not been precisely determined, and this process may be influenced by carbohydrate difference, baseline participant characteristics, like if you have insulin resistance and other issues. Other cutoffs could have been chosen to dichotomize duration. To be conservative, we also reported the p-value for their interaction involving study duration using this thing called the Bonferroni adjustment for all 11 possible cutoffs, blah, 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 blah. We performed primary analyses on the difference in total energy expenditure as presented in the trials to take into account variability in treatment intensity. For example, the magnitude of difference in dietary carbohydrate between the trials. We also calculated total energy intake per 10% decrease in carbohydrate as a proportion of the energy intake on low versus high carb diets. Now, that's a meticulousness you've got to appreciate. They were trying to get it down to like the degree of carbohydrate restriction, the benefit that you get in total energy expenditure. That's kind of cool to know that if you go 50 to 100 grams, it's this much increase in total energy expenditure. But if you push it down to 20 to 30 grams, or if you go to zero carb, it's fascinating. They tease that out. All right. So let's get to the meta regression. Using meta regression with these random effects, we included potential effect modifiers to determine how they affected the overall estimated means and accounted for variability in effects across studies. Blah, 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 blah. I want to get to some of this stuff because those of you that are non-sciencey are kind of going, okay, get to the part where you talk human again. Like I said, some of these studies, they get a little bit in the weeds. Just bear with me. I'm trying to interpret along the way. They did a sensitivity analysis. I don't really want to bore you with that one. Lower carbohydrate diets increased total energy expenditure, and updated and reanalyzed meta-analysis of 29 controlled feeding studies, the Journal of Nutrition, Dr. David Ludwig. If you do a search for that, you can find it online. All right, so let's get to the results. This is the juicy part. A total of 29 eligible trials. It included 617 participants were identified over a 38-year period, starting in 1982. That's where the earliest studies happened, all the way to 2020. Study duration varied widely from 1 day to 140 days. The average was 4 days, or the median, was 4 days. The mean, which was the average, was 13 days, including 23 shorter trials and 6 longer trials. The difference in dietary carbohydrate between intervention arms went from 8% to 77%. The median was 30%, and the mean was 33.2%. 4 trials measured total energy expenditure by DLW, which one was shorter, 3 were longer, 25 of them by WRC. 22 of those shorter, 3 longer. In addition to these design characteristics considered in the statistical model, trials also varied in the other aspects, such as randomization, crossover versus parallel, use of a run-in period, and dietary energy level, and baseline participant characteristics, things like weight, sex, age, fitness level, and health status. So the reproduction of the original meta-analysis, remember, they redid all the data. They didn't just trust from that study. They went back into all those original studies and reproduced a meta-analysis on their own. They took those 28 trials, the reported mean difference, and reanalyzed all that data. Heterogeneity related to study duration and macronutrient difference. In Table 1, which I'm about to show you, displays between study heterogeneity and variability in meta-regression models accounted for the 3 covariates of interest with the 29 trials in the updated analysis. The overall heterogeneity between studies without effect modifiers was 81.6. Study duration accounted for most variability in the total energy expenditure. So it mattered how long they went across all the studies, and reduced the residual heterogeneity furthest amongst the univariate meta-regressions. I'm sorry for all the language that's real complicated. There's the table, by the way, since I promised to show it to you. This language, this is definitely the language of research, you guys. Some of these researchers are real nerdy and like to use all the big fancy words, and I appreciate that from a scientific standpoint. Trying to be the person interpreting, I hope you can appreciate. I'm trying my best to explain what it's showing. Additional inclusion of the difference in carbohydrate between the experimental diets increased the between study variability explained in the model. All right. So then they included the updated meta-analysis considering study duration as well as the macronutrient differences. As study duration accounted for the most heterogeneity across studies, we performed meta-analysis separately for the shorter versus the long term. And what they found was the results from the random effects models indicated the lower carbohydrate diet had modestly lower total energy expenditure with the shorter durations. They actually found that there was a 50-calorie reduction in total energy expenditure with the shorter duration. Remember, the average was 4 days versus those who did the longer, substantially higher for total energy expenditure for the longer study was 135 calories. Now, that may not seem like a whole lot. What do you mean? Okay, increase expenditure by 135 calories, whoop-de-doo. Oh, but the cumulative effects of that over time will result in fat loss, will result in other positive benefits for your body. Taking into account dietary differences, the results per 10% decrease in carbohydrate, for each 10%, they had 14.5 calories, 21 calories, and then 50 calories. I'm sorry. Let me. The numbers are hard to read in real time, so bear with me. 14.5 calorie reduction for the shorter term, 50.4 calorie increase for the longer term. So you can see the benefit. And so for each 10% reduction in carbohydrate, you saw this much calorie either lowered or increased. Lowered in the first 2.5 weeks, increased after 2.5 weeks. That all makes sense? So the results of the 6 sensitivity analyses indicated that the primary findings were unchanged in terms of direction and statistical significance, consistent with the hypothesized duration of the adaptive process. The mean effect amongst longer studies was weakened by dichotomizing at 2 weeks and strengthened by dichotomizing at 3 weeks. In other words, it seems that 3-week threshold is where you started really seeing the benefit. So if they tested at 2 weeks, you're still in that decrease mode of total energy expenditure. But once sometime between 2 and 3 weeks, you see that ramping up where you actually see the increase in total energy expenditure. All right, so let's get to the discussion part of this. I hope this is interesting to somebody today because it's a little bit techy, but I think if you're going to choose to eat a low-carb diet and you want to know why you're getting some of the benefits, this is one of the things. Total energy expenditure is a deal that you need to know about. All right, discussion. In this updated and reanalyzed meta-analysis, we found that the heterogeneity among trials comparing the effects of lower versus higher carb diets on total energy expenditure is greater than was previously reported. Remember, this other study of the meta-analysis, which they took the same data, this other study concluded, low-carb diets, total energy expenditure, but they only went an average of 4 days. When they increased it to more than 2.5 weeks, that's when they saw the benefit, actually see an increase in your total energy expenditure. This is why you may have friends that say, hey, wait a minute, I tried that low-carb diet and it didn't work. You ask, well, how long did you do it? I did it for a week. A week is not a low-carb diet. You can't say you've been on a low-carb diet unless you've been for a period, I think, of at least 60 to 90 days. If you've gone 90 days of eating low-carb and you ain't seen no benefits whatsoever, either in your hunger, your satiety, your brain health, weight loss, any of those things, then yeah, you need to quit low-carb or do it correctly if you were doing it incorrectly. It's almost impossible not to see that benefit. When you control for duration and macronutrient difference, heterogeneity decreased substantially in the study. Among trials that are greater than 2.5 weeks, the lower carbohydrate diets slightly reduced the total energy expenditure at the beginning, but by contrast, when you go over 2.5 weeks, the lower carbohydrate substantially increased the total energy expenditure. These results suggest that the shorter versus longer studies have examined different physiological states. The former consists of trials in which participants experience varying degrees of metabolic adaptation to carbohydrate restriction. The latter consists of trials of sufficient duration to allow for proper adaptation to produce a consistent finding. This is why, guys, when you see a study or you hear about a study, you always have to get all the context of what it means. Don't just read the headline. How many people read the headline of the meta-analysis that they're responding to with this study? How many read the headline of, low-carb diets lower total energy expenditure, and they never got into the detail that the average that they ate was 4 days? Well, if you're only going to test it for 4 days, duh. But if you go long enough to see a benefit, you'll see a benefit. And that's the problem. They always say, well, it's unethical if you're seeing total energy intake expenditure go down. Why would you keep going? You would keep going because the adaptation thing is a known thing. And so we know it takes a period of time to adapt. Then you allow your body to adapt. This finding supports a prediction of the carbohydrate insulin model, and it suggests a mechanism whereby dietary carbohydrate reduction could aid in the prevention of and treatment of obesity. According to this model, the high insulin to glucagon ratio with diet high in glycemic load shifts the partitioning of metabolic fuels from oxidation in lean tissue over to storage in adipose tissue. If the effects observed here persist over the long term, then reducing dietary carbohydrate by half from 60%, which is typical of low-fat diets, down to 30%, which is still significantly high, but you could actually lower it even more, would increase energy expenditure by 150 calories a day, which would counterbalance much of the secular increase in energy intake thought by some to underlie the obesity epidemic. So if you keep the same amount of energy that you would normally eat, the same amount of energy expenditure through exercise, and you eat a low-carb diet, you're getting somewhat. And I remember when I first started blogging, Live and La Vida Low Carb, the blog 15 years ago, they were talking about, oh, you get a metabolic advantage when you eat the Atkins diet. And of course, all the experts out there, oh my gosh, what are you talking about, you crazy old man, talking about Dr. Atkins. There is no energy metabolic advantage of a low carb diet, but there actually is. 150 calories a day. It's not a lot, but if you cumulatively add that up over time, it should result in positive effects in your weight. Consistent with our findings, short-term versus long-term effects often differ in studies of dietary interventions. For instance, the rapid initial weight loss with very low-calorie diets is not indicative of the effectiveness of these highly restrictive approaches in chronic obesity. Thus, apart from mechanistic examination of the adaptive process per se, short-term studies comparing diets with differing macronutrient composition are likely to yield misleading estimates of long-term effects. That's true. If they only look at the initial period with any dietary intervention, you are going to see the highest amount of weight loss early on. We've seen it again and again and again with any diet. If you shift your body away from a junk food, like basically standard American diet, and go over to like a vegan diet, go to a Mediterranean diet, go to a paleo diet, or a ketogenic or carnivore diet, you're going to see weight loss probably in every single one of them, not because of what you're doing new, but what you removed from your diet, which is usually the junk food and the other fast food that is indicative of a standard American diet. So only testing in the short term doesn't really give you a whole lot of data to determine anything, which is why in all these studies, you always have to push it a little longer, ideally 3, 6, or 12 months for these diet studies. A main strength of this reanalysis is the ability to test a physiological hypothesis with adequate power, revealing an effect of macronutrients not apparent in their original analysis. We used a more conservative statistical adjustment to examine how study duration will affect the outcome, and then we conducted sensitivity analysis to examine all plausible sources of bias. In addition, we've made the database with the trials publicly available to facilitate transparency and further examination. So Dr. Ludwig and his team are doing this right. They're like, look, if you don't like what we've concluded here, go look at our analysis. It's all available online for you to check out. All right, so they did note some limitations in this study that warrant consideration. First, many of the trials used low quality data. In other words, they were small size, they didn't randomize, they limited methodological detail, especially for the older studies. Remember, they started the studies back in the 80s, and other issues. Second, we cannot rule out the possibility of dietary non-adherence to the test diets. So that's true if they're not in a controlled setting and you leave it to people and their devices, or leave people to just self-report their food, it could be non-adherence that could be giving the impact there. Participants in studies conducted at least partially outside of a metabolic ward could have underconsumed the study foods or consumed other foods off the protocol, which would affect the data. Dietary non-adherence would tend to inflate the estimation of the total energy expenditure on a lower versus higher carb diet due to dependency on this method. Conversely, they may have underestimated total energy expenditure due to the suppression of non-resting expenditure of the energy. Reassuringly, we found no significant heterogeneity arising from the total energy expenditure measurement method after adjusting for the study duration. Third, although ongoing adaptations between third week cannot be excluded, we had insufficient power to test this possibility. To the extent that the longer studies included incompletely adapted participants, effect estimates could be underestimated. Fourth, we did not examine quantitative aspects of macronutrients that might affect insulin secretion or metabolism, such as glycemic index. According to preliminary data potentially consistent with the carbohydrate insulin model, total energy expenditure decreased after 12 weeks with a diet high in sugar-sweetened beverages, whereas total energy expenditure either did not decrease or it actually increased by as much as 127 calories per day, with 2 comparison diets controlled for macronutrients that were either high in meat or fish. Dietary fatty acid types, specifically the relative amounts of saturated versus unsaturated, may also have metabolic effects of relevance to the energy balance and adiposity. Fifth, only one trial examined the effect of modification by individual level baseline biological characteristics, too few to include in a meta-analysis. The carbohydrate insulin model predicts that the largest increase in total energy expenditure with carbohydrate restriction will occur among individuals with the highest insulin secretion response to carbs, defined as insulin concentration 30 minutes into a standard oral glucose test. So I would think people that are insulin resistant would be the ones in that category. Information about such subgroup susceptibility may inform a personalized approach to weight loss, wherein a low carbohydrate diet might be targeted to those most likely to benefit, which I think that's where we're moving anyway. People often say, are you going to write more diet books? And I'm like, I think people are tired of diet books. I think they're ready for, how do I make this work for me? A highly individualized approach. But that doesn't ring, at least according to the way things have been. You've got waves of popularity. There was the Atkins diet, and then there was the paleo diet, and then there was the keto diet, and now there's the carnivore diet. And it's like, what's the next diet? I'm like, the don't diet, the figure out what works for you diet. Like that's where I see things going. In view of the complexity of the physiological mechanisms and inter-individual variability in response, potentially related to behavioral factors or biological factors such as insulin secretion, high-quality studies with different designs will be necessary to further elucidate how macronutrients affect energy metabolism and fat storage, with attention to potentially susceptible subgroups, and translate the findings to clinical interventions and public health messages. And I talked about this last week, on Monday last week, where we need good science to step up. And this is why you can't do a proper meta-analysis if you don't get good study design and study research, methodology, and everything that goes into making a good study. Important scientific and practical information could be obtained from trials that variously control energy intake, allowing body weight to change, control body weight by adjusting energy intake accordingly, or permit ad libitum food intake, controlling for confounding dietary and environmental factors when feasible. In addition, studies with participants on a low-carb diet prior to the randomization would also be of interest. Yes, wouldn't you want to know if someone has been on a low-carb diet for a period of time and then they enter into this study protocol? You're already well keto adapted. You don't have to worry about getting them into that adaptation period. An adequate trial duration will also be needed with this design, as consumption of a low-carb diet may protect for at least 1 month against adverse effects of dietary carbohydrate on metabolism through persistent reduction in insulin secretion. So guys, that is the study. And again, if you joined us late, the name of this study Do lower carbohydrate diets increase total energy expenditure? It's an updated and reanalyzed meta-analysis of 29 controlled feeding studies. Dr. David Ludwig, Kara Eberling, and other people in there. The Journal of Nutrition, December 3rd is when this came out. Go check it out. It's very sciencey. I like bringing the sciencey ones. I know sometimes people go, okay, Jimmy, we get it. Start speaking English, but it's important that you know the science behind the way you eat. All right, let's see what you guys have to say. We're going to come here first to Instagram, then over to Facebook, finally over to YouTube. Thank you all for being here today on Jimmy Rants. Just a reminder, jimmyrants.com is the website, and we go live right here on the Jimmy Rants page over on Instagram. Ray says, love your jersey. Yes, number 4. He got hurt this year, but they'll be back next year. Becky says, absolutely, they are too soon to jump to their conclusion. Yeah, when you look at only limited data of just a few days and maybe just a couple weeks, that's not really long enough to really conclude anything. And I would say that about any dietary intervention. If we're talking about a diet that's going to change your body and change metabolically things going on, any diet, don't just do it for a few days. Well, that didn't work. Well, you didn't do it. Like anybody that comes to you and says, I tried that low-carb keto diet and it didn't work. How long did you do it? 2 weeks? Yeah, you didn't do the keto diet because the keto diet requires at least 60 to 90 days. If you're going to give it a fair shake, you got to do it for about 60 to 90 days. If after 90 days you still haven't seen any benefit whatsoever, number one, I don't believe you. Because if you did it and you lowered carbohydrate adequately and you moderated the protein, you ate enough fat, you're going to get into a state of nutritional ketosis. You will feel it in the brain. You'll get great clarity of the brain. You'll get some keto clarity is what you'll get. You won't be hungry. You'll find yourself having to remind yourself to eat. That's how satiated you'll be. You'll get lots of energy. Initially, you may have some headaches. That's just an electrolyte imbalance. So make sure you're getting adequate salt and magnesium and potassium and eating nutrient-dense foods, which are mostly like the animal-based foods, minimizing toxins in your diet. There's all kinds of things you can do. And if you do it right, I can't imagine why you wouldn't see a benefit if you stick with it. Cariana says, I'm enjoying reading the original Atkins diet book per your suggestion the other day. By the way, the recipes are good, very 70s. Yes. The other day, somebody asked me on Ask Me Anything on Friday, what are your all-time favorite books? And so I recommended people go get the original Atkins Diet Revolution, not the Atkins New Diet Revolution, but the Diet Revolution, which was from the early 70s. I was like 1 when that book came out. But man, it was the original version. The New Diet Revolution allowed more wiggle room, some net carbs and things like that. The original one, it was total carbs. It was hardcore. So definitely a really good book. And I'm glad that worked out, Cariana. Thank you for letting me know you got that. Becky says the trend should be lifestyle books. Yeah. I think people generally know the various diet protocols now, and they pick their poison. And I even tell people just switch it up every once in a while too. Don't feel like you've got to be stuck to any one version of eating. Switch it up. Just like you switch up your fasting protocol, you switch up your exercise protocol, switch up your diet protocol. I'm becoming convinced that that's probably a good idea for most people, just so you don't get stuck in a rut with whatever you're doing. Val says, most people want you to hold their hand and tell them exactly what to eat and what to do. This is true in most aspects of life. My doctor loves that I am my own advocate. We don't always agree, but she sees that. That's good, Val. And you're right. People do want to be told what to do. I remember when I first started testing nutritional ketosis, which became the basis for this book here, people were like, Oh, so now I'm doing exactly what you're doing. I'm like, no, don't do exactly what I'm doing. That's what I'm doing. You need to figure out what works for you. And so it's a tricky thing because people don't like having to do that work, but that's really what you need to do. Becky says, right, then there's something hiding that they aren't honest about with themselves if they aren't seeing the benefits. Yes, you've got to be legit on it. And I even have come to the conclusion that if you want to get into a state of ketosis, the best thing you do is kind of go carnivore at first. If you want to add in carbs later, that's fine, but go full on carnivore, bacon, steak, eggs, pork, chicken, on and on down the line. And if you eat that, that'll kickstart fat metabolism. And then if you want to start adding in things that would make it more keto-ish, then that's fine. But start carnivore and that kickstarts your keto. All right. Thank you, Instagram. Let me pop over here now to my Facebook page, see if you guys have anything to say. I think you're pretty quiet today, and you are. Not one single comment from you guys. All right. Thanks for hanging out. There's a bunch of people here. They're just not talking to me. Thank you, Facebook. Now let's pop over here now to my YouTube channel. You guys are usually chatty, so let's see what you guys have. Debbie says, I'm still in Facebook jail. Thankfully, I can watch you on YouTube. Well, welcome. I'm glad you're here, Debbie. You must have been a naughty girl if you were banned on Facebook. Kenneth says the primary focus of New Balance Foundation is the prevention of childhood obesity. Okay, well, that makes sense. Thank you for that. They would study this. Hopefully that means some low carbohydrate on kids to kind of deal with the childhood obesity. Gary says, thank you. Very interesting info. Yes, you're right. A bit geeky, but well worth it. Yeah, I try to bring you guys studies sometimes, and that wasn't even the most technical one I did this year. I did one a couple months back about 9,1-divoc and some of the mechanisms about how a ketogenic diet can help with that. And it was so, oh my gosh, I was struggling reading through that study, but I had a few like real nerdy people that said, wow, better you than me. And I'm like, I don't know how to pronounce all the words always, but I kind of get the gist of what most of them say. And same with this one today. Dr. Ludwig got a little bit nerdy in his study today, but not too bad. All right, guys, that's it for this episode of Jimmy Rants. JimmyRants.com is the website. As always, you can engage live right here on Instagram. I am Jimmy Rants over there. Come follow us live on the show. We're here 11 a.m. Eastern time, Monday through Friday. So thank you for being here today. We also simulcast on Facebook as well as over on YouTube. Thank you all for being here. If you missed the live, you can watch it on replay on IGTV on the Jimmy Rants feed at Instagram. You can also see the replay over on YouTube. If you type in a keyword Jimmy Rants, you will find the show. Finally, you can watch all the past episodes as well over at jimmyrants.com. Depending on what's going to happen with all the censorship that's going on, jimmyrants.com will always have all of my episodes. All of my episodes will be on the jimmyrants.com website, so go check that out. And guys, I have some cool papers coming up for the next couple of days worth of Jimmy Rants. Tomorrow, I have a new research paper where they have identified a brand new personality trait that describes the tendency to see yourself as a victim. So do you know people in your life that always seem to play the victim? Well, they've basically isolated that personality trait and figured out where it came from. I've got all the details in a paper to read from on tomorrow. And then Thursday, I have a really bad study. I like doing the good science like I did today, but I really like doing the bad science as well so you can see what's wrong. So I've got a study about low-carb diets and coronary artery calcium progression. So that's the basically looking for heart disease. And they claim that low-carb diets lead to it. No, they don't. And I'll tell you why on Thursday. And then Friday is Ask Me Anything. So thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll see you again tomorrow. Bye. All right, you guys. I think I put a bunch of people to sleep with this one today because you guys were really, really quiet, abnormally so. But I get it. Sometimes these sciencey ones can get a little bit in the weeds, and so it's hard to know what to say when you go through all that. So there it is. All right. Well, thanks for being here today, and we'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye. Bye, YouTube. Come on in, Facebook.